All right? Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I understand there are lots of interesting events ongoing at the same time. I really appreciate you come to my talk. Right, so let's start. Nowadays, when people ask to give, say, 3 facts that they know about China, and I bet these are the 3 that are off the top of their head. China has a huge population, vast landscape, and has recently experienced rapid economic growth. Now, with such huge population, China has adopted the one-child policy, very controversial one-child policy since 1980. Now, that caused a dramatic decline in fertility rates after forcing mortality. Well, in consequence, the working-age population grows much faster than relatively faster than the total population. So if you can see from this population age pyramid, from 1970 to 2010, the share of the working age population aged between 15 to 64 gradually bulged out of the total population. Now, when fertility declines, the share of working age population increases. Then in this population, obviously you could say that few mouths to feed. Then for each family, within family, parents would get more time to work and save more money for future investments. And also, in a smaller size of family, parents would tend to invest more in children's education and health. So, such change in the age structure of population during demographic transition would help to increase labor supply, boost productivity, and increase capital accumulation, and thereby increase the income per capita growth. Now, this is what we call the demographic dividend. In China, the rapid demographic dividend in the recent few decades occurred at almost the same time with the equally dramatic economic growth. So as stated in the existing studies that the estimated demographic dividend to economic growth account in the range of 1/6 to 1/4. This is by no means negligible. On the other hand, think about the vast landscape. Mainland China got 31 provinces. Levels of economic development varies across provinces. Besides, China got a long tradition of dualistic economic development, and mainly reviewed between the dimension between rural and urban China. Well, in rural agriculture sector, there's unlimited supply of labor. A significant proportion of it is surplus in the sense that the marginal productivity of labor is extremely low. It's just about the subsistence wage level. Well, stories are quite different in the urban sector. Urban sector is much more capitalized. So drawing labor from the low productivity rural agriculture sector to the high productivity urban industry sector helped fuel the labor-intensive industrialization in China. Now, such growth experience for China is very much consistent with what Lewis said. That's what we call Lewis dualistic economic development theory. So the role of sector change in China has been highlighted, and many studies would accumulate to say, well, the contribution of sector change would accumulate to around 10 to 20% of China's economic growth. So China's growth miracle is often explained by either the Lewis story or the story of demographic dividend, of course, in addition to fast capital accumulation and technology progress. But I'm thinking that this could be just one side of the story. The link between sector change and change in the age structure during demographic transition has not been addressed. Now, let's take a step back. Think about the population policy in rural and urban China. As you may know that in most rural areas, couples are allowed to have a second child if their first baby is a girl. But this is very much restricted and down to one child per couple in urban China, no matter what gender their first baby is. So this caused the demographic transition in rural and urban China actually happened at different times with different paces. And also think about the variation of population policy between rural and China. This indicate that rural population would grow relatively faster than urban population. Therefore, it is able to supply labor to the urban sector and support labor-intensive industrialization. So I'm thinking that it is the varying demographic transition between rural and urban China that underpinned the link or the relation between sector change and change in the age structure. But as I said, in the literature, it seems nobody has ever mentioned about this triangle relationship. So here, I'm going to tell you a story about mini China. And also, if we can look at the full picture, then we could understand or we could see the trees instead of just focus on the wood. I'll come back to revisit those two stories, Louis' story of labor transition between sectors and the demographic dividend stories. Okay, so to show you what I'm going to talk about in the following 30 minutes, then here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to tell you how different is rural and urban demographic transition in China and how different are their impact on China's economic growth. And then we're going to follow the Lewis trend, re-examine the role of sector change, but from mainly focus on the productivity growth. And also, we try to look at the entwined impacts of sector change and demographic transition. So we try to look at the combined impact of these two factors on economic growth. And then say if we got time to look ahead and look back, see some of the interesting issues. So to start up with, let's look at China's demographic transition. At national level, China's demographic transition has been extensively discussed anywhere. So I'm not going to show you that picture. Instead, I'm going to tell you different stories about rural and urban China. So here's a picture shows the birth and death rate in rural and urban China. As you can see that obvious that the birth and death rate in urban China, indicated by those blue squares, fell much earlier and faster than in rural China. This related to a number of factors, for example, variation, as we just discussed, variation in population policies, and also related to, say, different sanitation condition, healthcare services that rural and urban residents take into account or enjoyed, and then also different pace of economic development. But all this indicate or things become much clearer when we plot the rural-urban dependency ratio. Well, just in case if you're not familiar with the dependency ratio, it refers to the ratio of the number of dependent people, either young or elderly people, to the number of working age population. And during the demographic transition, when fertility declines, then population growth, of course, declines. There will be a significant drop in the dependency ratio. But later on, in the final stage, when fertility declines further and population, say, longevity or life expectancy extended, then you will see an increase in the aged dependency ratio because we got more elderly people in the population. And that indicates the entrance to an aged society. So here, what you can say is rural total dependency ratio felt is much lower than the rural total dependency ratio. And the difference mainly stems from a much lower urban youth dependency ratio. There's not much difference between in the age dependence ratio between rural and urban, though there's in the rural sector, age dependency appears to increase more rapidly recently. Okay, so those two pictures tell us that demographic transition in rural urban happened or occurred at different paces at different timings. So what am I going, oh, I forgot this one. So if the last picture I show you is at national level, if we think about in the context of provincial level, you'll say, again, there's substantial variations. In provinces like, say, Shanghai and Guangdong, those borderlines, then they have much higher age dependency ratio and much lower youth dependency ratio than the provinces like Sichuan and Guizhou. So all I show here to you is huge variations in China within provinces, between rural and urban, and across provinces. So in order to assess the different impacts of demographic transition between rural and urban, here's what I do. I adopt the model from these two studies. I'm particularly familiar with the second one. So basically, we extend the Barrett type of convergence equation by incorporating the level of dependency ratio and the growth rate of the dependency ratio. The growth rate helped to capture the short-run impact of demographic change on income per capita growth, and the level helped to capture the long-run impact. Here, of course, we include a bunch of control variables, openness, marketization, geographic variables, and here what we want to focus is the rural-urban dimension of the dependency ratio. And the data we used covered the period 1990 to 2010, the most recent data for 30 provinces, once we include Chongqing back to Sichuan province. Now, before I show you the result, I want to give you some idea about what we expect from those two key variables of interest. The dependency ratio, as I said at the beginning, that when a population enters the window of demographic transition, we would expect fertility declines that would help to drop the dependency ratio. Okay, so when dependency ratio declines, it indicates the share of working age will have more workers within the whole population. And through various channels, for example, boost labor productivity, increase labor participation, or even help savings, that would help to boost income per capita growth. So actually here, we expect a negative coefficient, and that's the same for the growth of total dependency ratio. Okay, does it make sense? Yeah, sort of. Right, so here's the results. We include the growth rate of total dependency in all the specifications. And for the level of dependency ratio, in the first specification, we include the total dependency ratio, and the second one, we split it down between youth and age dependency ratio. The third one, we introduce the rural-urban dimension, and the last one shows the rural-urban dimension specified with age and youth dependency ratio. As you can see here, the contribution of demographic change to economic growth is very much attributable to the dramatic decline in the urban dependency ratio, particularly the urban youth dependency ratio. And the declines in rural dependency has not bring much significant impact on economic growth, right? And also, as you can see, well, there's a positive and significant coefficient for age dependency ratio. What it means here is it tells us a sign of aging and the detrimental effect of aging on economic growth. That's how I interpret it. Okay. Right, so that shows what we just talked about is the differential impacts of the differential impact of demographic transition in rural and urban China on economic growth. Now here, let's get back to the role of sector change. Okay, the best way to start up with the story of sector change is to look at the share of employment by sectors. As you can see that the importance of agriculture sector declines dramatically at the national level from 60% to 37%. For industrial sector, employment increased by a third. For service sector, it doubled. If we look at provincial level, there's very much variation. For example, here, if I pick up Zhejiang province and Guizhou province, you'll see their employment in agriculture sector declines dramatically. But if you look at two big metropolitans, Beijing and Shanghai, it looks like they've been deindustrialized, and their service sector becomes the dominant sector. Okay. Now, if we look at the growth of labor productivity, think about sector change. Sector change means drawing labor from low productivity sector to the high productivity sector. So of course, that would affect the share of employment by sectors, and also that is related to the labor productivity by sectors. Okay, so this chart shows the growth of labor productivity by sector. At national level, you can see here, of course, the high achiever is industry, and then service, and finally agriculture sector. And you may also find out that some provinces like Heilongjiang, Shanghai got much higher industry productivities than other provinces. So, many China's story. Okay, to assess the impact of sector change on economic growth, usually what people use is to estimate production function, get marginal productive labor, and then use the World Bank 1996 approach and put them together and compare the productivity gap between sectors and look at the changes in employment by sectors and then work it out. Okay, but here I'm using different approach because I'm thinking that it is very important that we look at the full picture, we take into account of the differentiation in the rural-urban demographic transition. So here what we do is based on the original model specification, we include the sector change. And we specify sector change as change in agriculture employment share and weighted by the productivity gap between those two sectors, between agriculture and non-agriculture sector. For non-agriculture sector here, include both industry and service. So here's our results. As you can see, first of all, sector change is highly significant across all specifications. So this confirmed the role of sector change in economic growth. This is consistent with the existing study in the literature. And secondly, you might find out that the dependency ratio, the demographic transition variables, behave very much similar as the one I showed you before, but they are much more significant once we take into account of sector change. And also, the growth of the coefficient for growth of total dependence ratio becomes significant. How do we interpret it? As we said, when the population enters demographic transition stage, fertility declines. This indicates the share of working age to total population increases. Okay. If the growth of working age population outpaces the growth of investment, then that would cause a decline in capital per worker. In the existing study, we define that as a capital shallowing effect because you simply got too many workers compared to the resources, the capital you have. Okay, so that shows a detrimental effect. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is at the beginning, I said, well, when we look at the role of sector change, most of people look at the impact of sector change on economic growth. Here, we want to look at from a different perspective, because there's one question bothering us to say, how does drawing labor between sector would help promote economic growth? Of course, it provides labor supply, but what other underneath mechanism? We would think of labor productivity. So drawing labor between sectors boosts labor productivity. And our result very much shown this. So here we change the dependent variable to be the growth of labor productivity. Instead of using output per worker, we use output per working age population because we take into account of those demographic variables, try to be consistent. Okay. So if I summarize the story I've shown you so far, then this is what we got. Okay. For demographic impact, the impact of demographic transition on economic growth, then the contribution mainly came from the substantial decline in rural-urban dependency ratio. Of course, this is related to the strict population policy in rural China. And we've already seen a sign of population aging, particularly in the urban sector, and its detrimental impact on economic growth. For sector change story, we show that once we include both sector change and different demographic transitions, then the demographic impact become more significant. And this shows that sector change and demographic transition closely entwined with each other. That's our hypothesis we proposed at the very beginning. So any one-side story, either demographic dividend story or the Lewis story, is incomplete. And if we, and also the sector change affect income growth by boosting labor productivity growth. So what we show so far is much fuller picture, including both stories, demographic dividend stories and sector change stories. Our results are very much consistent to literature, but we show a fuller picture. And also, this fuller picture can help us to look ahead, say, if we can see the trees. For example, back to one of the stories we just talked about, the Lewis story. Now, the recently focus of the research has shifted to whether or not China has reached the Lewis turning point. This has become very much contentious. Well, but just before that, let me interpret Lewis turning point. This is part of the Lewis story. It tells a stage where the surplus pool of cheap labor ran out. So in order to continue growing, the economy has to change the pattern from labor-intensive, for example, labor-intensive industrialization to technology or capital-intensive. Okay, so it becomes very popular or fashion to say, well, China has reached the Lewis turning point. So China has to change its strategic policy to adopt the capital-intensive or technology-intensive industrialization. Now I'm thinking that, pause, let's think about it again. If you look at the picture we show here, the different demographic transition between rural and urban, as you can see, yes, rural dependency ratio falls, but not as much as the urban. Okay. And this might be one of the reasons that the rural total dependency ratio are insignificant in our regressions. They don't have much significant impact on economic growth. Maybe it's just simply because it hasn't fallen so much. If we could, based on this picture, if we could do projections to say how much labor is still surplus or how much labor left in the rural area, that would be great. That can help to tell us that whether we will have this labor shortage, whether China has reached the lowest turning point. But in that case, we would need more detailed information like life table between rural and urban China, which we don't have it. At least I don't know right now. So when I look at this picture and think about the regression insignificant impact of insignificant impact of rural dependency ratio on economic growth, my answer is possibly China has not reached the turning point yet. Possibly we still have a big amount of surplus labor, especially the surplus labor shouldn't be just constrained to the rural sector. There's still a substantial amount of laid-out workers which have not found job in the urban China. And this conjuncture is very much consistent with what IMF just predicted in the 2012 country report. IMF assume different scenarios, for example, change the population policy and provide better institutional support to increase the employment or labor participation of the migrant workers and do financial reform or market reform. But basically what they tell is China has not reached the lowest turning point. It might take another decade until 2020, then we might be really running out labor, surplus labor. So that's about the lowest turning point. We need to be very careful about it because that would affect the strategic policy of the whole country. Now the other thing is about we get back to the story of demographic dividend. Again, recently the focus of the research has shifted to study how or whether economic growth would be impacted by population aging. From this age pyramid, you can see that the top of the population pyramid, that's the share of the elderly people in the total population, has gradually increased. Okay, and Chinese government has noticed it and it point out that the share of working age total population has failed for the first time last year in 2012. Then what kind of recommendation solutions the government has come up with? Of course, there's a set of reforms regarding to the welfare system and healthcare system. But what about population policies? Are we going to release the one-child policy yet? So far, I haven't heard anything about it because what government concern is, look, China still have, yes, last year our share of working age to total population fell, but we still have more than 900 million working age people. So the most important thing is to provide jobs for them. Okay. And the government also point out that two groups of people facing great challenges to find jobs. They are not only rural migrants, but also college graduates. Especially this year, 2013, going to be much more difficult for a college graduate because there will be 7 million fresh graduates and other graduates who have failed to find employment and will come up to the market and compete. So to sustain economic growth, to continue to enjoy demographic dividend, to continue benefit from sector change, the most important thing to do is to boost employment, create jobs. Right, I'm thinking that right now I'm standing in Australia, so it might be sensible to tell some relationship between China's economy and Australian economy. Of course, everybody knows China is the biggest trading partner, but from the demographic point of view, that what we can tell is because rural and urban demographic transition varies. Urban population aging first. So they would have different demands. For example, nowadays you would say more and more Chinese people, when they go overseas, they buy healthy products, fish oils, vitamins, and go back to China, and they would request more health services. But at the same time, there are still Chinese people in the rural area, they couldn't even feed themselves. They need clean water, and they need food. So there's a diversified demand. And also, to fully beneficial sector change, the Chinese government now has shifted the production line gradually from the coast to the inland in order to draw surplus labor to support the industrialization. And also, there's a strong promotion of urbanization. One of the key purpose is to try to maintain those or keep those rural migrants in the local area. So think about the investment needs. There's still very much investment potentials in mainland China from that perspective. So that's about it. Thank you very much.